My name is Aubrey Mayer. I grew up in Africa, in South Africa, but I live in London, and for the last 20 years have been directly involved in the UNFCCC, the creation of it, the negotiation of its protocols, and also in the IPCC. The elephant in the room is the objective of the convention, which is to stabilize concentrations of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere, lest we forget, at a level which is both stable and safe. And I have a question for the panel in relation to the strategy which a few friends of mine and I devised to realize that objective, which some of you may know, called contraction and convergence. But please, may I, just before I put that question, make a point, since the subject of media has come up, directly to my old friend Nik Gowing. You responded to the gentleman from Kiribati when the island that cost $2 billion came up, suggesting that he might get a discount. I know it was a flip remark, and we all do it. But that actually speaks to the heart of the tragedy that we're already involved in, which is, if you really understand what the gentleman for Kiribati, the Maldives, Aosis, and many other places are saying, if you understand their message, it is they who are providing the discount of their lives being lost to climate change, because we are all captured in an economic system globally which prioritizes economic growth over every other thing, and has already, on the record, conducted through the UN an economic cost-benefit analysis of climate change, which proved, because this is literal, it's important people that know this, that it was cheaper to adapt to climate change than to prevent it, because the mortality costing was basically rich people to poor people at a ratio of 15:1.
Could I ask you to put it
My question is about contraction and convergence, which was explicitly to repudiate that ludicrous genocidal economic arrangement. And in terms of contraction and convergence, to say the elephant in the room in Copenhagen still is achieving the objective of the convention. The UNFCCC executive itself said in 2003 that achieving it is inevitably dependent on performing a full-term contraction and convergence event. In respect of the Africa group of countries, they certainly acted in concert and very responsibly at Kyoto, endorsing contraction and convergence. In respect of the Asia Development Bank, very recently they published a very high-level statement, it was called, with many illustrious people signed up to it, saying that contraction and convergence solved this problem globally. And the point is, it's very simple to understand. To achieve the convention's objective, you have to have a deep contraction globally of emissions, and the sharing of that globally will be equal per person. And if it's hard to achieve that immediately, you go there by convergence. Now, my question to you all is, if you're going to go to Copenhagen with a strategy, will you please primarily be guided by that focus, that what is primarily required is the prevention of dangerous runaway climate change and the establishment clearly of that principle in that UN negotiating process from Copenhagen onwards? Thank you.
Right. I'm going to ask you to come back to that in a moment, because there are at least two here and one here who'd like to intervene. Please, you've been very patient. And then John Holmes.
Good morning. I'm Bertrand Picard, President of Solar Impulse. I think we all agree on the problem. We all agree on the solutions. The problem is that almost nothing is being implemented. And I believe the Senator of Philippines gave one very good explanation for it. It's a problem of inequity. How can we get the powerful and rich people commit themselves also for the weak and the poor people? And I believe philosophy and wishful thinking will never work for that. I believe we really have to push a trend where the public opinion is going to push the politicians to do something. The politicians always react extremely well if the public opinion is pushing them in that direction. So now we are not anymore on protecting the panda bear or the white tiger. We have heard this morning that there are people and countries being extinguished very soon. There are forests being extinguished very soon. I believe it's in that direction that we should go, maybe not only the media as we heard, because I don't think it's enough, but huge campaigns talking to the people of the countries in order to push their governments to do something. And basically we have 5 months to do it before Copenhagen. Otherwise it will be huge speeches and no action again.
Before you sit down, can I clarify, are you talking about this political pressure within the countries themselves? In other words, much more from the bottom up?
We have to put, in my opinion, the political pressure in every country, because there are also rich and powerful people in the weak and poor countries. So it's everywhere that the rich and powerful people should find their own personal interest to do it. If they are finding some profit in doing it, they will do it. If they find some people voting for them, they will do it. If they get good compliments in the media, they will do it. But if they don't find a personal interest, they will not do it. So let's give them an interest to do it. Let's give them an advantage. Let's push a trend that will make these people feel well because they commit themselves.
Thank you. Could you pass the microphone back to Sir John Holmes, please?
John Holmes, I'm the Emergency Relief Coordinator, and I was chairing the Global Platform on Disaster Risk Reduction, which Senator Legarda was talking about just now. Just 3 quick points perhaps to bring us back to the current consequences of climate change as opposed to the mitigation agenda. I mean, I think it's very easy to fall into fatalism and the feeling you can do nothing about this. Actually, we can do something about it. Of course, we can do something about emissions, as people have just been saying, and we have to do that. That's absolutely fundamental. But we can also do things about the current consequences of climate change by measures such as disaster risk reduction. You can't stop the natural hazard. You can't stop the flood, the cyclone, the drought, at least not easily until you sort emissions out. But you can make sure that it doesn't turn into a total disaster by what you do in terms of action on the ground, in terms of reforestation, water management, making sure people don't live in floodplains, all the measures that we can take and must take. The second point, therefore, is that if we're going to achieve that, there has to be some resources there. If there's going to be some resources there, we have to make sure that in Copenhagen we're not only talking about mitigation, reduction of emissions, fundamental that is, but we're also talking about adaptation. Adaptation doesn't drop off the agenda as it tends to do. And we have to get that message across to the negotiators in Copenhagen, the national experts, the international experts, so they all get together so that there's no gap between the climate change negotiators on the mitigation side and the disaster managers as well. They're all together and it's one negotiation. And if that negotiation about adaptation is going to succeed, there's got to be resources to go with it, which is a third point. Of course, we can do things, as Loren Legarda was saying, like putting 10% of what we pay for disaster risk reduction, response to disasters and reconstruction after disasters to disaster risk reduction, or 1% of development aid. But that isn't going to be enough, and it also leads you into a real problem about an argument between development and climate change efforts. I mean, they're not in contradiction, but they can be put there if we're not careful. So we need to have some kind of adaptation financing mechanism which is much more automatic and generating much more resources by using part of the proceeds of carbon emissions trading, carbon taxation, whatever the mechanism might be. It's got to be there, it's got to be automatic and generating resources that can then be used to address the consequences of climate change for people right now.
Let me pick up on those 3 points. We heard contraction and convergence, the need for much more pressure on that from you as nations at risk, the political pressure in any country, more bottom-up pressure, more from the public. You talked, Senator Legarda, about the problems on logging that you would face, even though it's recognised as a significant problem. And that final point about more adaptation on these issues. Mr. President.